Well, hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another Cats discussion. Look, it's not a religious one this time. Get off my back with the religious stuff. We are going to be talking to, well, an old friend, actually, Conscious Caracal, or I'll let him explain his name and everything else of that. And as you can tell, we have a face reveal as well, though apparently I'm 6 months behind on that one, so oops. So, Conscious Caracal, would you like to introduce yourself and tell everybody about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me on, Common Sense Guy. I mean, we've been acquainted on previous streams on other platforms, on other channels, but it's nice to be here in my personal capacity with my face showing, basically. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and yeah, I hope you have a good discussion. I'm live from the southern tip of Africa for those that are still unaware. But yeah, I'll try my best to answer all your burning questions, and we'll see where the conversation goes from there. But maybe just a bit of context. So I am a South African YouTuber. I'm also on Twitter under the pseudonym Conscious Caracal, but my real name is Adams van Zyl. And I also work for the biggest civil rights organization on the African continent, AfriForum. So that's my background, a little bit about who I am for those that are unaware.
Oh, no, you can't get off that easy. You're going to have to be able to explain not intricacies of what you do, but the fact that you've moved up so high up in the world at this moment in time that you're actually talking to politicians and actually going on radio shows to be able to actually argue points about civil rights in South Africa.
Right. So my little humble YouTube channel, I started it back in 2016, I think. And it was just a channel where I posted memes and like little short clips. And then back in, I think 2017 or 2018, I started doing like live interviews with people. And since then, my channel's just grown. I started doing videos about things happening in South Africa to inform people both domestically and abroad. And yeah, just doing political analysis. And so from there, my channel just grew and up to a point now where I'm very humbled by the amount of people that tune in live, people that share my videos, people that follow me on Twitter. It's absolutely amazing because I'm just a regular person. I didn't have a strategy. I didn't start my channel with a plan. It just happened organically. So that's something that I find very, very interesting. But yeah, so from then I started talking to people all across the political spectrum, in South Africa, from the US, from the UK, talking about just politics that concern them or topics that are relevant during that time. And my most recent big thing that I did was I did an interview series with, as people know, well, as some might not even know, South Africa had their national election this year, and I did an election-themed interview series where I talked to a representative from each one of the parties that I find very interesting. So I talked to a representative from the newly formed South African Capitalist Party, talked to a representative from COPE, the Congress of the People Party, talked to a representative from the VF Plus, the VF Plus, who are like a smaller minority representing party. And then also and lastly, I talked to the chief whip of the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, which was a very interesting show as well. So yeah, my channel's grown quite a lot, and I'm very, very satisfied with the interaction that I'm encouraging. I really like that people are interested in South Africa, and that's why I'm very, very appreciative of the fact that you invited me on to talk about it tonight. It's an awesome opportunity.
No, I mean, I'm very interested in finding out more about what's going on all over the world, but I find it very interesting with somebody that I suppose the personality in general, as in how, though I don't know you as you, but I know of you and I can say I've talked to you. And though they may not be the heights of some people would want to scale to, but you're definitely scaled a lot higher than most people would try to even scale. To be able to have conversations and interviews with people that are from different parties and actual representatives must be an amazing step up from just having conversations with people like little old me and the ogre back in the day.
Yeah, well, it's really something that's still sinking in. I mean, like I said, I didn't start my channel with a plan. I didn't start it with this dream of I want to become like a political commentator on YouTube. It just kind of happened. Same with my Twitter following. People just started following me because they liked what I had to say, apparently. So yeah, for me, it's definitely been a very interesting experience. It's been something that's really shown me the need that is out there for truth. People that really want to know what's happening in South Africa. And as we've talked off air, I'm just a regular guy. So if you want information about what's happening in South Africa from someone on the ground like me, then pretty much, yeah, then my channel and my Twitter accounts are the place to be. I'm giving my opinions as a regular South African. I don't work for like I'm not a journalist. I'm not a politician. I'm not someone that's like really involved in the South African political sphere, like in terms of parliament or whatever. But yeah, that's what I try to do. I try to inform people. And like I always say, don't just believe what I say, research what I say. So I'll give you the facts as I know them. I'll give you the what's happening in South Africa. But if you're feeling a bit skeptical about some of these things, I will definitely drop some sources as well. And you can also do some research for yourself to just make sure that you are fully informed about what's happening in the world around you, rather than just taking someone's word for it.
Yeah, exactly. Always clarify and always go over your own points and make sure that you always research what you're talking about. Otherwise, you get caught out like I do most of the time. But I find it interesting that obviously most people would say that South Africa's leading party at the minute is probably, should we say, are on the verge of being socialist or on the verge of being communist, depending on who you speak to on that aspect. But there is a complete and utter new party, as you said, as an actual capitalist party. How did that come about? Or is that just in opposition?
Well, firstly, I maybe have to clarify that the ANC is pretty much openly socialist. It's not something that's being debated or something that's being speculated about. Something that the listeners might not know is the fact that the ANC internally has a structure of what we call the tripartite alliance. So the ANC is pretty much allied with COSATU, who represent the unions, and then, and this is going to blow your mind, the South African Communist Party. So the South African Communist Party is plays an active role within the ANC alliance, within their structure. So it's not like some secret or some conspiracy theory. Like our Minister of Finance is an open communist, someone that calls themselves a communist. So it's not like people call him a communist just because he's on the left. No, our Minister of Finance is someone that is a genuine communist. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment. I think a lot of people look at South Africa, and if you look at, for example, let's take the election as a way to demonstrate this point. So earlier this year, we had our national election. ANC won with about 57% support. Second was the DA, the Democratic Alliance, which are pretty much a carbon copy of the American Democrats ideologically. And they got about 20%. They were down from 22% to 20%. So they actually took a knock because they embraced a bit too much socialism and try and keep up with the ANC. And then in third place was the EFF, the very far left racial nationalist party. On their website, they label themselves Marxist-Leninist. So these are like the real deal. These aren't your local Antifa that role play as communists. These are actual Marxist-Leninists in the South African parliament. So those are the top three parties. Now, the South African Capitalist Party is an interesting concept because they only were founded this year. They weren't able to gain a single seat in parliament. They only got, I think, 14,000 votes, and you need about 30,000 for a seat. So I wouldn't say they're like a real player within the South African political environment, but it was interesting that within this environment currently, that they came to be, that there is now a South African Capitalist Party. While the South African Communist Party isn't in parliament, they are literally part of the ANC.
So basically, when everybody is saying that, as you said before, that it's conspiracy theory, no, they're not communists, they're not this, they're not that. They're literally basically openly saying that, no, we're communists, and if you don't like it...
No, it's in their charter. It's in the ANC's charter, in their manifesto, if you will, where they pretty much talk about the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution, where they will use socialism as a stepping stone to communism. It's not like some type of secret. It's not something that Alex Jones talks about or South African conspiracy theorists talk about. It's something they openly talk about and something you can find right now online. You can go read their manifesto or their freedom charter if you're right now, and it's there. Like it's not something that's being hidden. It's in complete plain sight.
So I suppose the next question to that is how is their freedom charter actually affecting South Africa then?
Well, if you look at their policies, that's pretty much textbook ANC. I mean, they are working on a framework of mass welfare in terms of not really, they are to an extent allowing the free market, because if they didn't, it would completely collapse the South African economy. If there weren't some free market aspects, I mean, investors would flee like they already are now with talks of land expropriation, which is just another step within the NDR. The NDR, the National Democratic Revolution, the next step is the expropriation of land, which would mean that all land in South Africa comes under state control. And then the next step, something that they also are basically saying they want to implement, and we are in advanced stages of having that actually happen in South Africa, is an NHI, so a national health insurance, basically having all health care in South Africa publicly managed. So we are pretty much on a very, very, we are on a steam train towards full-on socialism, even though our economy or our political regime is already very, very socialist.
I remember last time that we were talking, that you were talking about how the water scare last year or the year before was getting quite bad. Is there any sort of differences on that? How are the actual services that are supposed to be now nationalised with the ANC, how are they actually taking shape?
Well, that's the thing, is we've actually recovered slightly from that water crisis. I mean, that was the headline that everyone was quoting, the fact that Cape Town is going to run out of water. We were pretty close. I mean, it was pretty bad, but we've had some good rainfall. We're not out of the woods yet. We still need a few seasons, consecutive seasons of good rainfall to get to the levels that we need to be. But that crisis has been averted. But yeah, it's just it's a product of just the centralized state. It's not competitive. It's not efficient. They're just doing a job for the sake of it. They just manage the water supply for the sake of it, not doing it as efficiently and as productively as possible as the free market or pretty much a private institution would. So yeah, but at least I can say that the water crisis has been averted for a while. It's currently winter, so about half of the country gets its rain now. Where I'm living in Pretoria, we get our rain in the summer, so the winter is just cold and dry. But yeah, we don't have a water crisis in Pretoria at the moment. Where I used to stay, Cape Town, there it's still pretty dodgy, but we'll see where it goes. It's not at that level where the whole entire city is going to run out of water, but we'll see. And also, just for interest's sake, the Cape Town is situated in the Western Cape, which is one of the 9 provinces of South Africa. And the Western Cape is the only province in South Africa run by the Democratic Alliance. So the official opposition control that province. So yeah, they also kind of dropped the ball in terms of this water thing, which has, I think, affected their public trust in the opposition to really actually deliver. But it's a very complex situation.
No, I get that. I mean, I suppose my next question to that would be if say, for instance, you're talking about the nationalisation or the government control, if you will, of institutions like water. Does that mean that there's not really too much of, should we say, private companies that are providing competition anymore? And is that
the South African water supply is completely state provided.
So I suppose my question to that is, has that extended to other aspects then? Is there still privatization that's still going on, or is it just more of a nationalization that's going on out there?
Yeah, there are still a lot of free market and private sector aspects, like, for example, healthcare, which is now under threat. South African private healthcare is still in existence. It's actually where a lot of South Africans from the middle class and up get their healthcare. But that is also now being threatened by this NHI program that's being proposed. So organizations like AfriForum that I'm working with are actually opposing this type of legislation or this type of policy, where we are arguing that this full-on centralization of healthcare would definitely just obliterate the South African economy, seeing as we are already so indebted and all our state-run enterprises are pretty much bankrupt, like the Post Office and South African Airways and Eskom, which provides our electricity. We, at the beginning of the year, had very serious blackouts. It's better now after the election, but we're still also there in some very deep trouble in terms of the Eskom, the state electricity provider, the only electricity provider in the country, is heavily indebted and struggling to really provide a constant stream of electricity to the entire country.
Wolfie in the chat says that you might want to mention that we do have state healthcare also, except that it's not very good. Not in
right. Yeah. No, that's correct.
Well, the reason why I wanted to ask you about the nationalisation, because obviously I would know what's nationalised in the UK, but I don't think many people would know what's actually nationalised in South Africa and what is actually being provided or pushed to be more nationalised, and how the economy was to how it's going with the ANC in control.
Well, at the moment, like I said, the healthcare is still something that is largely, it still has a very big private sector presence. Electricity is completely government provided. Road construction is entirely government provided. We are actually, the mining sector is still largely private, but there are also talks about centralization of the mining sector and nationalization there. So we are definitely not moving towards an investor-friendly environment or more of a private sector-friendly environment. We are actively moving away from it in almost all aspects. We are moving towards increased taxes, increased state centralization, increased welfare state, basically. And it doesn't really help that we are living in a country with about between 27 and 35% unemployment rate. The majority of those people are on social grants. I think 18 million South Africans, I'm talking under correction, might be off of a few million. About 18 million South Africans are on some type of welfare. And we have a population of 57 million.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. That's a lot
and
of people.
1 in 3 South Africans are unemployed.
Yeah. I suppose my next question to that would be, is there any sort of chances of work? And is that the reason why in some aspects of some media are reporting that violence is increasing out there? Though I don't know.
Yeah, that's also a very complicated matter in terms of you can't. Yes, I would say that in some aspects crime is getting worse, but in other aspects it's pretty much stable. It depends on really what type of crime. If you're talking about, for example, farm murders, there's definitely an increase. It's getting worse. But in terms of actually a very interesting stat, the amount of farm attacks has drastically increased, but the amount of farm murders is only steadily increasing, which means that farmers are actually getting better equipped and better at defending themselves. So even though more attacks are taking place, less farmers are being murdered, or the rate of increase of farm murders is less. So it's actually showing that there's a more cooperation between farmers. Communities are getting organized, and farmers are just have more knowledge in terms of how to defend themselves. But I can give you some stats there if you want to get into it. For example, how many farm attacks and farm murders there's been this year.
Yeah,
and
go for it. The shock value actually provides to people how bad or how it actually is out there, rather than it being just media censorship or media exploitation.
Right. So this year in June, actually, AfriForum published the latest stats that we've been collecting in terms of farm murders and farm attacks. And in June this year, from the beginning of 2019 up until June, there were 184 farm attacks and about 20 farm murders. Now, this might not seem as a lot, but then you have to take into account the really small percentage of the population that are actually commercial farmers, which really puts it into perspective. I mean, you also, I mean, let's look at, for example, a year like 2017. In 2017, there were 84 farm murders. Now, a lot of people would say, well, 84 is not that much. I mean, there are 57 murders on average in South Africa every day. But then you also have to take into account that those are 57 murders out of 57 million people. If you take the farm murders into a ratio, in terms of ratio, there are about, I think, 36,000 commercial farmers in South Africa, which actually puts in, my math is too bad to give you an exact number, but it pretty much puts the farm murder rate per 100,000 somewhere between more than the average policeman and more than the average South African. And let's say, for argument's sake, I mean, this is one profession. This is one type of profession that's being targeted. So how would people react if, for example, 84 journalists were being murdered per year in South Africa, or 84 lawyers or 84 politicians were being murdered per year? I think that really puts it into perspective.
No, it definitely does. I mean, I think that the targetization, because that's a word, the targeting of farmers in general seems to be, to me, it seems to be politically led, especially, and again, conspiracy theory and that sort of stuff. But if you actually have the ANC actually coming out and saying that they actually want to buy white farmers' lands back so that they could actually give it back.
Oh, no, not buy land back, expropriate the land. So without compensation, literally take the land. That's what's on the table at the moment.
But that to me just seems absolutely ridiculous. If it shouldn't matter what color the person owns the land. I suppose you could argue that it matters how long you've owned the land, but then again, you could get into technicalities about that as well. No. But if you own the land, don't you already owe it?
Also, something very interesting now that you mention the conspiracy. Also, a stat that we collected this year was the fact that out of those 184 farm attacks, not murders, farm attacks, only 61 of those cases, anything or money was stolen. 61 out of the 184. So a lot of people argue that these are only social fabric crimes. And looking at the stats in terms of if 61, not even half of them involve cash being taken, there's something else afoot. And then you also have to take into account that we have high-profile politicians in South Africa actually really just trivializing violence. There's a very popular song that goes, kill the boer, kill the farmer, shoot to kill. That actually a lot of cases have been, even recently, where high-profile politicians have sang that song. I mean, the leader of the EFF, Julius Malema, sang that song very recently. And this is a guy that has 3 million, I think, followers on Twitter. And then you have politicians using slogans like "one settler, one bullet." Wow. I mean, this is not fucking fringe things. There was another thing that also happened. I don't think it was this year. It was last year, where there was I think it was a master's thesis or an honors thesis. I don't think it matters, but there was a master's or an honors thesis submitted at the University of Cape Town, UCT. And it was signed "One Settler, One Bullet," a political science thesis. And the vice chancellor of the university actually praised that paper.
Wow. That just...
I mean, and you can go, just for people listening, you can go look that up. UCT vice chancellor, "One Settler, One Bullet" thesis. And you will go a mainstream outlet even reporting on it. So it's not something that's been just in the shadows or something that's a conspiracy theory. You can go look for yourself. It was widely reported on.
That's just, I mean, I know that I was joking before we went on air about the race war and everything else like that. And I was actually honestly joking. But when you hear rhetoric like that, you can understand how some people would grab that and run that as a conspiracy theory.
Right. That's the thing. So you have far left and far right narratives surrounding the issue of farm murders. I try to be as centrist as possible. I just want people to know the real facts. So a far left narrative surrounding farm murders would be that there's nothing happening. It's just normal crime. It's just social fabric crime. But like the stats that I've provided earlier, also something that you need to take into account is the horrific torture that's being reported in many of these cases. Young children being drowned in boiling tubs of water, people having drills drilled into their feet, women being raped for hours. It's not people that just go in, steal, and go out. A lot of these farm murder cases last for hours. There's actually a video, people can go check it out after this, on AfriForum's YouTube channel, uploaded the story of a farm murder survivor, a woman that tells her story. You can just Google or you can YouTube search AfriForum farm murder survivor story, and it was published this year. And she tells the story of how for about 4 or 5 hours this guy was just torturing her and her family. If I remember correctly, and this might be disturbing to people listening, asking the woman's son to rape his mother, things like that. So absolutely horrific things. And she offered the man her jewelry, she offered him all the money in her purse, she offered him everything she had, and he said no, he doesn't want that, he just wants bullets. So yeah, these types of cases are absolutely horrific, and you can, if you look at the frequency of these types of cases where there are torture, where it's not just rob and run, where it's actually trying to cause as much misery and pain on the victim as possible, you can't help but ignore the fact that there is something else afoot. It's not just normal crime. Some of it is, but a lot of it, even the vast majority of it, if you look, for example, at the fact that only 61 out of the 184 cases actually had something stolen. What's the reason they
try and jump onto? It is a case of, it doesn't actually seem to be a case of, as some people would say, that it's just normal crime, it's just a basic robbery that's gone wrong. It's like, if you are literally torturing somebody and then asking their children to do stuff to the parents, for instance, for lack of better terms, then that's down to hatred and coercion. That's not down to, I need to rob you. That's down to some sort of form of hatred and ideology.
Right. And then the big question comes up, but where's this coming from? And I do think I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of the hatred aspect. I think a lot of this hatred is coming from the rhetoric from very mainstream politicians that villainize white people, that constantly talk about how these white South Africans came to South Africa and stole everything from you, enslaved you and raped you and killed you and whatever. And just constantly frame white South Africans as these absolute monsters that deserve almost revenge or some type of action. And I mean, in a country of 57 million people, a lot of them very impoverished, I would not be surprised. I mean, it's pretty logical to think that there would be quite a few psychopaths that would take that rhetoric and then just be filled with so much hatred and anger that they would be willing to go out and just go to a farm and inflict as much damage and pain as they could on this person that has been framed as the reason for why they are in the shit situation that they are. Framing basically the person that's been framed for all the problems that are happening in South Africa. And yes, so I do think a lot of this hatred comes from the rhetoric that just goes unpunished. I mean, again, the leader of the third largest party in South Africa, the EFF, Julius Malema, has said on numerous occasions, he said it now mockingly, but he said, we are not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now. And you can go find that on YouTube as well. It's pretty much, it's not something that it's going to be difficult to find. That's pretty much pretty mainstream.
To be fair, I actually remember, I think watching it, I think you actually quote tweeted it before, I think around about 3 to 4 months ago, if I'm not mistaken, though I may be. But to quickly jump on something that you said before, I'm not sure that it takes somebody that's a psychopath to be able to take up that sort of ideology and rhetoric. If you're in an impoverished state and somebody's telling you that it's somebody else's fault, then it would be a case of you could quite easily transfer your problems onto it's somebody else's fault. And especially if you're not educated enough due to poverty and stuff like that, then it's quite easily a narrative that you could latch onto to provide that it's not your fault and you can do something to change it.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, let me just put it very simply. People that are desperate really love a scapegoat. I mean, it's an irresistible temptation to blame all your problems on some type of scapegoat. And unfortunately, minority groups make excellent scapegoats. Something I find quite funny on a bit of a lighter note, Americans and also people in the UK over there, when they hear minority, they instantly think of, for example, a Muslim person, a black person, LGBT person. In South Africa, I'm pretty much a super minority. I'm a racial minority and a linguistic minority and a cultural minority. So I'm a triple threat when it comes to being a minority. So that's the interesting thing, is that when you talk about minorities in countries like the UK or America, it has a completely different connotation than when you're talking about minorities in South Africa.
No, I mean, I completely understand that. It's like if you were talking about minorities in the Middle East, you'd be talking about people that are not from the Middle East. So it's interesting that us in the, should we say in the West, we naturally assume that when we're talking about minorities, that we mean the minorities that are actually in our own countries, rather than actually trying to take a look and understand that the demographics are different.
Right.
We naturally assume that we put our own experiences in place of information that should be provided, like we should go and look. So for me,
exactly.
it would be, go on.
No, I'm just saying exactly. Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point to me, because that's one of the reasons why I actually want to start trying to talk to people that are in different countries, because we naturally assume that we understand what's going on because we try to empathize. But the thing is, to empathize with somebody, you put your own self into their position or how you perceive their position to be. Where if you're already going, well, we're talking about minorities, so we're talking about people of color, for instance, to use politically correct terminology, for instance, that would be absolutely false in South Africa. It would be the Boers that are parts of minorities. So it's interesting that when you talk about those sort of things, different words have different connotations in different places, but yet we don't take the time to actually learn them. We just assume.
Something also, and I talked to way back in the day when me and Oga and on his channel we had Sargon of Akkad, and I talked to him about the fact that I don't think people realize how damaging a lot of this leftist rhetoric is when it comes to, for example, countries like South Africa. So, excuse me. What happens is now you get to a country like South Africa and you start hearing things like white privilege and white tears and white fragility. These very antagonizing words to white people. Now, in a country like the UK or a country like the US where there's a white majority, this is not really it doesn't carry the same weight as in, for example, a country like South Africa, where you then demonize a small group of people. You're demonizing a minority. I mean, that's if you look at history, that's very, very dangerous. I read a quote the other day from Joseph Goebbels, where he's basically scapegoating Jews, and he's talking about how there's something along the lines of in top positions of power, the German element is almost completely absent. It's all controlled by this one minority. And then I just look at, like, for example, ANC rhetoric and South African politician rhetoric, and it's exactly the same. They're pretty much saying, like, yeah, look at like all these CEOs and look at all these positions of power. They're all taken up by white people. I mean, it's the same. You're demonizing a minority to, and another term that's originated here, it's actually a propagandist term that was thought up by a literal propaganda think tank that was exposed a few years ago. The term is white monopoly capital. So it's a term used to demonize the white monopoly and saying they pretty much own the entire economy and they are in control. There's this one figure in South Africa, Johan Rupert. So he's a South African billionaire. Yeah. And there are all types of conspiracies about how he can, at the snap of his fingers, just collapse the entire South African economy and things like that. So it's really not the same. The type of rhetoric, if you, for example, use terms like white privilege and white fragility and white tears and all this shit in countries like the UK or America, it doesn't carry that same weight or that same like danger that it does in a country like South Africa, where whites are the vast minority. Especially in a country where you also then make it worse. You pour oil on the fire with politicians that are constantly blaming all the country's problems on the white minority. It's really not a good situation. And I don't think a lot of people realize how they see it as innocent terms actually have real world consequences, where you are arming rhetorically racial nationalists in countries like South Africa to really demonize the groups that they target. You're giving them the rhetorical tools to pretty much blame all the country's problems on this small minority of people. Like, for example, white privilege, which I actually had a debate about on another South African YouTuber, Ronaldo Gos's channel. I don't think it's an applicable term for South Africa. I don't think white privilege, you can say that a white squatter in South Africa has more privilege than the son of the president. You can't really talk about white privilege in a country that has a government that is 99% black. I mean, that's where all the power is. And now you're talking about how this tiny minority is running the country. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I suppose that we could go on to the aspect from both sets of countries, mine, the West, and South Africa in itself. It seems then that the rhetoric itself is about how people perceive their surroundings. And as we've already tried to allude to, how people want to use minorities as scapegoats, and in some cases, minorities within a majority, say, for instance, white Jews in certain aspects for the Nazis, for instance, that's now been transmuted into, or transformed, should I say, into the use of using white people in general in South Africa, and how that rhetoric that has been devised from the West has just been taken by people to be able to demonize people and cause more of a problem and a danger. Because as you said, you have literal politicians saying, no, we're not going to cause a white genocide, or we're not going to kill the whites just yet. Those are your leaders.
Yeah, these are, I mean, I think, unfortunately, a lot of South Africans have just become desensitized to it. It's not as shocking anymore. It's just business as usual. I mean, there you have the president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, going to countries like the US and on major international forums, when asked about farm murders and land grabs, outright denying that any white farmers are being murdered or that any land grabs are taking place. Now, something interesting from that whole fact, excuse me, something from that entire fact that I think is very, very telling is earlier this year, the New York Times, there was a land grab in a small university town called Stellenbosch. I actually studied there a few years ago. And there was a land grab just outside the town on a wine farmer's farm. And the New York Times was there, and they interviewed this farmer. And this whole article was it's just all this propaganda about how he's living on stolen land and he's living on this land that was taken from black South Africans. Meanwhile, the land that he's living in, it's in the Western Cape, so it's in the most southern tip of South Africa. That part of South Africa was not inhabited by black South Africans. It was inhabited by small groups of Khoisan, who now today are, their descendants are called the Coloureds, which is a completely different chat for another day. They were the original South Africans. The black South Africans also migrated from inner northern Africa, from the north, from Central Africa. But yeah, I'm getting off track. So what happened was this entire article was just this incredible amount of propaganda and misinformation about the land issue in South Africa, which is a very complex issue. It's not, excuse the pun, so black and white. And then, so what happened was, now they write this very, very propagandistic article about this wine farmer living on stolen land. Then now his land's been occupied, kind of implying that it's justified and whatever. 2 months or a month later, and in that article, that farmer talks about how he's received threats and how his life has been threatened by the protesters. And there's even a clip online of one of the protesters saying, if someone has to die, then so be it. 1 month later, that farmer is murdered. And that is the farmer that the New York Times interviewed and wrote that very propagandistic article about, basically demonizing white South Africans again, but very slyly. And then a month later, that farmer is murdered. Now, you might argue that it's not directly that article that caused it, but it's that type of rhetoric, definitely, that I think played a role. It's that type of demonizing, that idea that all these white farmers are just land thieves, even though if you know South African history, you know that it's much more complex than that. White South Africans didn't just land here and stole everyone's land. There were many ways of land acquisition in our history. I just finished reading this book recently, The Mind of South Africa by Alistair Sparks. Now, Alistair Sparks is not a right-winger. He's actually quite left-wing. But he wrote this entire 500-page book on the history of South Africa from the 1600s, when the first Dutch came here, up until now. And he gives the history from every group's perspective. And the interesting thing is that this farm where this wine farmer was situated in the Western Cape, white South Africans the Dutch that landed in the Western Cape only encountered black South Africans, or the Xhosa, at the Fish River, which is about 700 kilometers from where his farm is. That's where we encountered them for the first time in 1770, and this is well documented. So up until the Dutch came to South Africa in 1652. So only more than 100 years later, they only encountered black South Africans for the first time. The Dutch there at the Fish River. So it's really not that simple, South African history, as a lot of people think. It's very complex. And a lot of people also don't understand that people can go look for themselves to get a better perspective. If you you can type in Google demographic map of South Africa, and you'll see the Western Cape, for example, where Cape Town is situated. The amount of dots on the map that represent black South Africans are pretty much non-existent there. Only in Cape Town there's a few, because that's where a lot of people move or immigrate for jobs. But black South Africans didn't occupy the entire South Africa since the dawn of time. They also migrated down here, and the Dutch came here, arrived in Cape Town in 1652, and they only encountered black South Africans for the first time 100 years later at the Fish River, 700 kilometers from where they landed. So it's really not like they landed on the beach and they were just black tribes everywhere and they dispossessed all this land. There were nomadic tribes, the Khoisan, but like I said earlier, black South Africans are not the descendants of the Khoisan. The Khoisan descendants are the Coloureds, which are a completely different group. They don't speak any of the black South African languages. They have a language of their own. They have a culture of their own. They are actually, if you really want to go that route and you want to talk about the actual owners of South Africa or the original people, only the Khoisan have a stake really in the country. They are basically the Aborigines of South Africa. They are the original inhabitants. And really, I have a lot of sympathy for their culture and for their group, because they were slaughtered by both this new settlers and the black South Africa, the Bantu tribes moving down. So what happened was, as the Khoisan didn't settle, they didn't build houses, they were completely nomadic. They moved from cave to cave and pretty much hunter-gatherers. And then when the settlers came here in the Cape and started planting crops and claiming pieces of land, it started becoming very inhospitable for these nomads. So they started moving north. And as they move north, the Bantu tribes are moving down south, and they get sandwiched in between. So they were absolutely slaughtered. So then those that are left fled into the Kalahari Desert, which is this absolutely inhospitable part of South Africa where nothing can survive. But the Khoisan knew, like, if there's someone that's going to survive there, we can. So they fled into the Kalahari Desert. And that's where they still, most of their pure blood descendants are still there to this day. They're like the only South Africans that really still speak the Khoisan language, the clicking language, live in that desert, the Kalahari Desert.
Huh. Well, I've got two questions I would like to put. I would like to tie all of that together, what you've just said, and ask you a question of, do you think that the media themselves, and by the media I mean historical documents, historical documentaries, for instance, and westernized ideas of how history went, shapes the way that people perceive the history of the African continent as a generalization, specifically as well, obviously, South Africa?
Unfortunately, yes. I think, and you might take some offense to this as a Brit, I think an excellent example of how history skews people's perceptions are you can get from Jacob Rees-Mogg, that basically said about the Boer War concentration camps where my ancestors were put in, pretty much described them as they were philanthropic. They were there to protect they were there for the own good of the locals in South Africa, which is absolutely not the case.
I know that's that's bullshit.
Yeah, and I think, and I just bring that up as a demonstration of how you can distort a story where the victors in the end, I mean, that in the end, the first Boer War was won by the Boers, but then the second Boer War, the British Empire just said, okay, now we're going to roll up our sleeves and properly fuck you guys up. And they, well, the ironic thing is the British Empire thought it was just a bunch of farmers, and they told their soldiers that the war would be done in 3 months and the soldiers would be home for Christmas. And then the war lasted 3 years. And because the Boers started guerrilla warfare, and then they were only defeated when the British Kitchener implemented scorched earth policies, or scorched earth strategies, where they burned down every farm they found and captured the inhabitants and put them in camps. And interesting enough, a little bit of trivia for anyone listening, trench warfare was actually invented in the Boer War and then used in the First World War. Very interesting fact. It was invented by the Boers.
I mean, very, very quickly, I mean, I'm not too much of a history buff, but one thing that I can remember, and I think it was actually the Britisher that actually told me this, or it could have been you in a discussion with him and yourself, that the reason why they were putting the Boers in, should we say the term as it is, actual concentration camps, was because that they were trying to keep the men in the camps to break them, why actually doing stuff to the women and to the children to try and to mentally break them because they couldn't beat them physically.
That's almost at the core of it. It's more the psychological angle of these Boers are fighting for their families and their children, their wives and their children. If their wives and their children are dying in camps, then why should you fight? What are you fighting for? So the British were actually using that strategy to break the Boer spirit in terms of, if you have nothing to fight for, then why are you even here in the first place? So it's almost that's more the angle that they took, where pretty much subjecting these women and children to these absolutely terrible circumstances to break the spirit of the fighters, so they don't have anything to fight for. But yeah, it's pretty much, I don't want to derail the entire conversation. Yeah. I mean, South African history is fascinating. I mean, it's something you can have an entirely different conversation about. But again, I think that just proves the fact about how history, to get back to your initial question about how history can be distorted and how you can inject a narrative to completely turn a situation on its head and paint a saint as a villain or a villain as a saint. And I think that's happening all across the world, not only about South African history, but about, I mean, a lot of the history about the British Empire as well is distorted by the countries that were colonized, or academics in those countries, or people that just want to demonize Brits in general. I think there's also a lot of disinformation going on. So I don't think it's something that just goes one way. I think it's something that happens all across the world from all directions, in terms of people editing history to suit their own narrative.
Yeah, I mean, we can still see that today. How, as you saying about the New York Post, how they were demonizing a particular farmer that was coming forward to be able to give their story and what they might do themselves to protect themselves, or what was going on in the narrative. and how they don't understand the situation that's going on into a country, and as I alluded to before, try to sympathize, because they weren't trying to empathize at all, but trying to sympathize with them by trying to say, well, I can see what's happening in my country, and I'm going to use that as my core understanding and place it.
Excuse me, before you continue, I'm just going to fill my cup so you can continue with the story while I'm just getting some more water.
Yep, no worries.
Excellent.
But that's what I was going to go for, where I would have actually said that with the idea of how the media is in general, and we can see this from the actions that have been going on, and actually talking to somebody like yourself, Conscious Caracal, about South Africa and how things are not necessarily as bad as some people would put, but nowhere near as good as what others would say either. And that conflation doesn't give the right sense of story that's actually going on. And that sense of story needs to be told. But because it's in a different country, westernized media and the conglomerates in the media can narrate what way they want that story to go. So if they want to make the ANC sound like they actually are good, then they don't post about one bullet, one bore, one bore, one bullet, or death to the white farmers, and so on and so forth. They won't report those aspects, and they will skewer the story to be in a positive light for the ANC. For instance, if they were to say, as you said, with President Ramaphosa coming to America, they would roll out the carpet. But yet, and I do know it's a conflation of type, but if they were to put in somebody like North Korea, as in Kim Jong-il, or Kim Jong-un at the minute, obviously, then they would say that he's very bad for doing what he's doing. Now, don't get me wrong, I know Ramaphosa is nowhere near the same level, and I do agree that he's not. But if you're going to say that that person's bad for doing what he's doing, then why aren't you condemning somebody that is trying to say, or at the bare minimum, joke about people that are actually dying in their own country? Why would you open that up to yourself as a country, as a narrative, not unless you're to spin it? I hear that you're back, CC.
Yes. Something also a bit of a silver lining this year. Actually, not too long ago, a few weeks ago, the Dutch Parliament voted on a motion that was presented to reject South Africa's plans of expropriation without compensation, making them the first parliament in the world to reject South Africa's plans. So to put this in perspective for a lot of people that don't know, might think, oh, it's what's South Africa going to care? It's just the Netherlands Parliament. They are one of our major trading partners and a very influential country in terms of historically. The Netherlands, actually, ironically, was one of the most vocal voices against apartheid in the previous century. So them now condemning the ANC's policies as well actually shows some principle and makes their motion carry a lot more weight. So I think that's a very positive development that we definitely welcome. The first parliament to reject South Africa's plans to literally just take land from people without giving them anything in return and throwing them on the street, basically.
Well, that's one thing that I was trying to point out, that you have certain leaders that are probably not accepted in most westernized countries, or at least would be protested. But you would probably get President Ramaphosa that would come to the United Kingdom, for instance, and most people would cheer for him, for instance. And obviously that's hypothetical, but I would presuppose that that would happen. But yet you would actually have a leader that is actually willing and is proposing, at very, very least, to take land off of people for literally no reason other than their skin color and apparently something to do with heritage. Why do we why do we trade with people like that?
And I think something that also comes to the fore, it actually links up quite nicely with what we were talking about just a few minutes ago. I mean, you're of British descent, I'm of Boer descent, but what our ancestors did to each other in the past is in the past. I don't hold it against you. I don't hate you for what some people in the past that are not even directly related to you did. I think that's something that is the most disappointing about the current narrative in South Africa, is that you can blame the offspring of people that might not even have done what you're saying they did, and you can take it out on them. I think that's incredibly unfair. That would be like me refusing to come on your show because I just hate British people for what they did to people that are part of my culture. It's irrational.
No, I completely and utterly agree with you. But I suppose that the question to that, as it would be, should we say, representative of how the left would treat the whites and how they would treat the blacks, as in how that they would say that we have to be responsible and pay reparations for slavery and so on and so forth. Would that be something that the left themselves use as a victimization to make you feel sorry or make you feel that you're a victim and should fight back and be against those types of people that they, should we say, villainize?
And also, for people that are interested, there's a documentary that was released this year, Disrupted Land, which is specifically about the history of land ownership in South Africa and also the current land debate. Very well produced. It was produced by Forum Films, which is actually a company that is affiliated with the civil rights organization AfriForum that I'm working with, full transparency. But it lists all its sources. It's very well made. I didn't have a hand in making it, but I definitely would recommend it for anyone that wants just some information about what's going on. But well, I can also give you some stats that I actually, when I knew I was coming on your show, I actually made some notes. My memory is too bad to name them from memory. But just to give you some perspective on the land situation in South Africa. So by the time, and I think it was in 2018, or was it 2017? I can't remember. By the time that the South African Parliament adopted the motion on expropriation without compensation, which means that they are going to seek to change the South African Constitution, Section 25, which relates to private property rights, to allow expropriation without compensation. By that time, about 95% of land claims had already been settled. So just for context, a land claim, we had a system in South Africa where if your family was dispossessed after the 1914 or so, early 1900s Land Act, 1918, I'm very bad with dates. If your family was dispossessed by the government of their land after that act was enacted, you had a legitimate claim and you could prove that that land was dispossessed, you could claim it back and you could get it back. Yes, 1913, thank you in the chat. So by the time that the government decided they're going to seek to amend the constitution, already 95% of those land claims had been settled. So people that could prove that their land was dispossessed by the previous apartheid regime, well, not even the apartheid, it was before that even, by a previous South African regime, was able to get their land back. And then another stat that's also very, very eye-opening is the fact that 82% of those land claims were for urban areas, not rural or agricultural land. And 93% of all land claimants opted for financial compensation opposed to getting the actual land back. 93%. And these are government stats. 93% of those land claimants would rather took financial compensation than the land itself. So that really gives you some perspective.
So just so I can understand this, that would mean that around about only 7%, if they were to have claimed the land back and didn't take compensation, so 7% of people that made a claim for the land,
yes,
actually were people that would have owned the land or had families that owned the land beforehand. That means over 93%, as you said, are new claimants that wouldn't have had any ties to any.
No, not exactly. It's 100% of the claimants, or these are all the successful claims, all the land claims that were successfully, these people could prove that their family was dispossessed. And then they had the option, if they could prove it, they had the option to say, I want financial compensation or I want the actual land. Sure. And of those people that could prove that they were dispossessed and their land was taken from them by the previous regime or that government at that time, from then up through the apartheid regime up until now, if they could prove their land was taken, they could either get financial compensation or the literal actual piece of land. And 93% of those successful claimants took the financial compensation as opposed to getting the actual land back.
Yeah, no, that's what I was meaning. That with the people that actually did claim the land back from the Land Act, that from my understanding, that from the people that claimed the land back, that 93% of those people that took financial compensation are no longer descendants of people that were actually owning the land beforehand. Or am I wrong in that?
No, they could claim that they could prove that they were descendants of the people that were dispossessed.
Yeah, no,
But
I understand that, but I mean, they took
Mm.
financial. They took
yes,
financial back.
yes,
Took financial instead, which means that they no longer claim the land.
yes, yeah, they no longer own that land. They didn't take the land back. They were pretty
Yeah,
much just compensated for the expropriation or
sure,
the land that was taken. Yes.
sure. Which also means out of those stats, then that if you were to say that 93% out of those stats, specifically those stats, not out of all of land, but out of that
Mm.
specific stats, that 93% of those people that took the money instead means that they no longer have a land that has their descendants that used to own it, which means that
No.
93% of those lands are no longer owned by anybody that would have had any ties to any sort of form of slavery or disposition beforehand in
Right.
those stats specifically.
Mm. So, and here's another damning stat, which actually really encapsulates the entire land debate. And that's the fact that 95% of all these farms that were, of all land reform projects in South Africa taken on by the government, where they actually, because there is a system in place up until now where the government they can buy land. So if there's a willing buyer and a willing seller, they can go to a farmer and say, okay, here we want this piece of land, and here is the market price. We'll buy it from you, or nearly the market price. So that was the system up until now. And of those successful handing over of land, where the land was bought from a farmer, handed over to someone else, a black South African, for example, 95% of all those projects uh, have failed, where those commercial farms were transformed either into subsistence farms or squatter camps. 95%. And this is an official stat. This is not some speculation. If
Didn't
anyone's
something
interested,
similar like that happen in
I'll post
Zimbabwe?
the link as well in the chat.
Didn't something similar like that happen in Zimbabwe when they were getting rid of the white farmers? They tried giving it to black farmers, and it almost completely destroyed their farming agriculture economy because nobody knew how to farm.
No, correct. A lot of farms in Zimbabwe. That's one of the big reasons why there's currently a famine and a food shortage in Zimbabwe, is the fact that their agriculture industry just completely collapsed. Because people don't understand. Being a commercial farmer is not just having a little piece of land and planting seeds there. You are a businessman. You are an entrepreneur. Every day you're watching international prices. You're managing a business. You had to go to university for this. It's not something that just happens. You had to get educated to be a commercial farmer. It's not just something you do and walk in and do it. And then also, it's not just that. It's also, and you can see it in that documentary, Disrupted Land. It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free. They talked to a black farmer that was given a farm by the government. And what happened there is the government didn't give him everything that was promised. They gave him a tractor and some cows, I think, and they didn't give him the fertilizer. They didn't give him the financial support that they promised, all these things. And that's also one of the big reasons that they fail. So a lot of these cases, the people have the knowledge, but the support that is needed to get their farm off the ground is also just not there. All that money is looted by the government or just lost through corruption. So it's not just that incompetent people are getting farms, it's also largely the government is just not giving them the necessary support. It's a really bad situation.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, I find that interesting that the government themselves would go out of their way to give, I won't say give, but would buy land necessarily. Let's just use that as a colloquial, but would buy land from certain people and was to give it to people that didn't do any sort of background check to see if that they could actually farm or produce anything, and then give it to those types of people that didn't know, doesn't matter color, but didn't know how to farm, and wondered why their agriculture economy started to crash and why they had to import more and why they had to spend more on taxes.
Right. And another interesting stat. Oh yeah, but please continue first. Finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say it doesn't really make sense because you could go with the point of if they were doing it for just to try and make a political point, but as soon as a year comes forth, or maybe 2 years of certain farms not producing what they used to produce and working it out, surely a government with all the statistics and statistic gatherers that they have would be able to work out that the economy would crash in the future. I assume you have something similar to the ONS as the UK, the official National Statistics Agency.
So, and another stat for people to chew on is that the Institute of Race Relations, which is also an NGO in South Africa that does polling and research, very unbiased, very, very solid research. They did a very comprehensive poll in South Africa in terms of what average South Africans think would benefit them. And they listed a few things. And according to their recent poll, I think it was I'm saying it's recent, but I think it was in 2018 or 2017, only 1% of respondents said that more land reform would improve their lives. Their biggest concerns were jobs, education, and crime. Those were the big things that they wanted government to solve and things that they wanted to see improve, not land reform. That was not their biggest concern by a long shot.
Wolfie in the chat says that you have STATSSA, which is probably our equivalent of the ONS, which collects the stats, but does give them to the government, but the government ignores them. Which, as he quite rightly says, is a circle of life. And Jack in the chat says, "Well, what government is actually competent?"
Well, so the South African ANC government takes incompetence to a new level, so might just keep that in mind.
That's exactly where I was going to go. There may be no government that is incompetent, sorry, but there are levels of incompetency.
Yeah, I mean, our previous president built himself a palace, or almost R500,000 palace for him and his 20 wives with taxpayer money. I don't think you can point me to a British politician doing anything similar, or a British prime minister building himself a castle with taxpayer money.
To be fair, I find that so. But then again, I suppose that's about news narrative and then the control of the media and government. I suppose that the government controls most of the media out there as well, does it?
We actually have a very free press, technically. But we have a lot of captured journalists that just suck on the government teeth, basically, and praise them and say that Cyril Ramaphosa, there's a new dawn and he's our new savior. But yeah, our press is pretty free. There's not a big crackdown on journalists or like very strong China level restrictions on the press. That's actually something that's very positive about South Africa, is that there is still a relatively free press. And people are able to investigate these things and we are able to report on this type of corruption. Whether that reporting leads to actual action and heads rolling is a different matter.
Well, the reason why I say that is because surely that if you have the free press, as you say, then wouldn't they have reported on that aspect? And wouldn't the people that can read, I suppose, I'm assuming a lot for my own, should I say, country in this aspect, but wouldn't people that be able to read, or at least be able to have conversations with people that can, at least, wouldn't they see that their politicians have bought something that is massively expensive and then wonder why they've got nothing?
That's the thing, man. They did report on it, and it did sweet blow all to the ANCs.
How did they spin that then, or did people just not care because they're so?
People don't care, man. Well, maybe I'm oversimplifying it. It's basically what happened was the ANC has such a grip on rural South Africans that what happens is these people worry about other things, not about corruption. They worry about what's going to happen in the next month, whether they're going to survive. So a lot of, and I think this is something I told one of my mates once is, oh no, it wasn't one of my mates. It was actually this person I was talking to that said she doesn't know where all these ANC voters are coming from. And I said, well, you've never driven through rural South Africa. I have. And it's an eye-opening experience where you drive and you just see houses and houses and houses as far as you can see. There seems to be no end. And you just think, where are all these people working? How are the lives of these people? And then you realize these are all ANC voters. This is where their base is. It's not in the highly urbanized areas. The majority of their base is in rural South Africa. People that don't buy the newspaper because they're worried about, are they going to have enough food? They can't spend money on a newspaper. They're worrying about, can they buy bread for the next week? So that's the unfortunate situation, that yes, the press is reporting on it, but it doesn't reach the average South African. And and then there's also the faction of supporters that just don't care. They think it's white propaganda. The media are against the ANC and trying to take it down, and they are the enemy of the people, if you will. So they're also that faction of pretty much rich and middle class ANC supporters that know about all these things, but they just ignore it and think, but that's the previous president. The new leader of the ANC is going to fix everything.
Yeah. He's going to take over from the old president straight away. In other words, he's going to buy himself a bigger castle.
We'll see. But that's currently where we are. Rampant corruption, completely destroying the South African economy and the people's trust in government. And like the previous president, Jacob Zuma, said, the ANC will rule until the day Jesus comes back. So I'm still waiting for that day patiently, and then we'll see what happens.
Well, you said about the Capitalist Party. I know that you were saying that it didn't gain too much, but from my understanding, it was only created this year or last year, or had the foundation
This year.
last year. So how much did it actually get in the vote?
It was formed this year, and they got 14,000 votes, which is about half a seat. So they didn't get a seat in parliament. But they ran a pretty much very low budget, almost 100% social media based campaign. But I think they learned a lot of lessons. I think they're going to, if they want to earn a seat in the next election, they're going to have to go into rural areas and actually reach average South Africans and not just use social media. And also, capitalism has a bad name in South Africa, man. Like I said, we are pretty much a socialist country. The majority of South Africans seem to have very strong socialist tendencies, even though socially they're very conservative. South Africa is actually socially a very conservative country. But there's a lot of support for socialist policies, for welfare policies, for big government policies. And as they say in the chat, 14% of 14,000 votes aren't bad for less than a month of campaigning. Well, that's true.
But that's where I was going to go. If the party itself has only literally been created this year and has only just been campaigning for a month, as Wolfie says in the chat, then surely it would be a case of, if they have more of a platform, and as you say, they went into rural South Africa and were able to say, well, we'll be able to provide you with some more schools, or we'll be able to provide you with work, or those types of promises, then surely there would be an idea of actually changing some people's minds. Because if the ANC are the only ones that are promising rural South Africa these types of promises, even though they're not delivering, the promise is still going on and on and on. So people believe the promise because they have nothing else.
No, that's true. And we'll see. I'm very curious to see where the party goes in the future. We'll see what happens if they adapt their campaigning strategies, what they do. I'm very interested to see where they go. But I do think a lot of parties also learned a lesson from looking at the South African Capitalist Party. They learned that you can't run a campaign purely on a social media platform. You're going to have to reach real people in the real world. So we'll see where that goes in the next election, if South Africa is still around by the next election.
I suppose my question is a hypothetical question more than anything. If you were to go into politics, and obviously I'm not suggesting that you are, and if you are, that's up to you to decide, but if you were to go into politics, what party in South Africa would you join, and why?
None of the existing parties. But I think if you ask the question of whether I would like to become a South African politician or consider it, I think you vastly underestimate my ambitions.
Okay. So on that case, then, would you like to elaborate a little bit of what your ambition would be?
Well, I'm very happy at where I'm working right now at AfriForum, the civil rights organization. I mean, I'm already working for the largest civil rights organization on the African continent, which is already something that's really excited me. And we're bringing about real change. I mean, we are doing everything that the government is failing at. We are setting up community safety networks to help prevent farm murders. We are fixing potholes. We're going to towns and painting street signs and making sure that everything that's falling apart is fixed and is working. And just to give you some perspective, we are a predominantly, or actually we are an Afrikaans organization. So our language is Afrikaans, which is my home language as well. And so our target market, or the people that are supporting us, our members, are pretty much Boers. And there are about 2.7 million Boers in South Africa. And we have 223,000 members as of the last week. So almost 10% of the entire Boer population is a member of AfriForum, if not more, if you exclude like children and families where not every family member is a member of AfriForum. But we are bringing about real change where I think politicians got us into this mess. So I don't think politicians are going to get us out. My view of the future for South Africa is that our problems are going to be solved by regular citizens, by organizations and NGOs like AfriForum, organizations of people that are rolling up their sleeves and fixing problems on their own rather than waiting for government to fix them. So I don't have any aspirations of going into politics because I think that would actually diminish my influence on the world. I would rather help an organization like AfriForum make some real changes by giving trauma counseling and help to the survivors of farm murders, doing awareness campaigns, fixing potholes, painting street signs, planting trees, all the above, things like that, doing real, tangible things in the real world rather than just going on a podium in Parliament and screaming and ranting for 2 minutes.
Oh, it sounds like you're doing some really, I don't mean to be patronizing as to say this because I know that it's going to sound that way, but it does sound like you're doing some really good body work. And it sounds like you're enjoying the work that you're doing. Do you think, taking from what you've just said, do you think that you'd be taking the idea of a more, should we say, a libertarian or capitalistic type of view, where it's a case of the citizenry would be the ones to be able to fix the country in itself?
Well, we have our own brand of what you're talking about. AfriForum is the civil rights arm of the Solidarity movement. Now, Solidarity is a workers' union in South Africa. But the difference being that workers' unions are usually associated with the left wing, where the Solidarity movement is a Christian union. So the whole mission of the Solidarity movement is what we call in Afrikaans self-beskikking, or the self-determination. That's the English word, where you're not going to go out into the veld and draw like a little box and say, okay, this is my country now, stay the fuck out. Rather, we're going to work within the system to fix it, or at least create satisfying environments for our members. So what we're doing is, for example, the mission of self-determination means you create communities that are as independent of government as possible. They still function within the South African economy. They still use the currency. They still vote in the elections. They still have South African citizenship and passports. But those communities are increasingly then responsible for their own security, for their own water, for their own electricity, for their own maintenance of their town and their community. So our mission is not to secede immediately, but to rather create communities that are as independent of government as possible through the mission of, as we call it, self-beskikking, or self-determination, if you will.
It seems to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure I am, but it seems to me that not your plan, but the organization and how you perceive yourself in that organization, is that if you are to convince more and more people not to join your organization, but to have the self-determination and to be associated at least with it, then you don't have to necessarily deal with the actual politicalization of politics, but you can actually not take back the country, but yet almost create a new country around it with just the fact of people self-determining and being a coalition. Am I understanding that right?
Let me put it this way. You're not taking back your country, you're taking back your community. So, for example, Solidarity has already built its own private university because state-run universities in South Africa are pretty much in a steady decline, being taken over by leftist identity politics and, as we call it, decolonization in South Africa, which pretty much means if the person whose work you're studying is white, his work is worth less than if it was written by, for example, a black person.
Mm-hmm.
So as that is going on, organizations like Solidarity have created their own universities, which is just another step towards creating communities that are completely independent of government, that do not rely on government for service delivery or education for their children or safety or fixing the roads or whatever. They do it themselves. As we say in Afrikaans, we say we are doing self-doen, do it yourself. So we're rolling up our sleeves and we're doing it ourselves rather than relying on government.
So apart from the terminology, I'm not really that wrong then.
Yeah, you're pretty much on it. I'm seeing there in the chat. So Ain't Jack asks, what I heard was it's illegal for Zulu Africans entering SA, which is causing a lot of issues. Not entirely correct, seeing as the Zulus are one of the largest demographics in South Africa. They are South Africans.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a foreign culture. They actually are one of the main. The Zulu is one of the official languages of South Africa. They are the biggest black demographic cultural group in South Africa. So I don't think your facts are quite correct there. I don't know where you heard about illegal Zulus. It's like saying there are illegal Welsh in the UK.
That's the thing though about the misinformation that can be going around. I know Angjack himself does try to be a troll, but generally that seemed like an honest question in himself.
Okay, yeah, he seems to have clarified. I thought there were other. Oh yeah, okay. So he's talking about the Khoisan. Yes, the Khoisan are the original South Africans. They are if you really want to go that route, they were the original inhabitants of South Africa. Very small nomadic groups that moved around, but I wouldn't use the term illegals when talking about the Zulus, seeing as when the Zulus moved into South Africa, the country of South Africa didn't exist. There was nothing here. It was just the Khoisan moving around, their little nomad tribes. So it's a bit before borders and the Union of South Africa before that happened. But yes, they were technically invaders. They were people that migrated down, encountered the locals, wiped them out, and took land for themselves. That's pretty much the essence of it.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, that's the whole thing about how any sort of form of media can twist anything to how it can or can't be, and just the misconceptions that we can have ourselves, which having talks like this really helps. And as I said at the beginning, and I said to you off air, we have the internet, but yet somehow we don't seem to transition to different countries to be able to talk about what the politics are in different countries and just have general conversations with people that are in different countries or different continents even. And isn't that what the internet was for? To be able to bridge that divide of what the media narrates that we can and what we should and what we shouldn't know, that we can ask somebody like yourself to give us what's going on in their opinion of their country rather than trusting our own media.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think that's the brilliant thing about the internet is now you can talk to someone like me, just a regular South African on the ground. I can give you perspectives that you're not going to necessarily find in the mainstream media because there's a lot of disinformation going around, not just from international media, but from domestic media as well. I made a video about this on my channel. I think it was last year, where it wasn't a South African, anyway, a mainstream media outlet went to farm workers or like a local person, and they asked them, oh yeah, it was when Donald Trump tweeted about South Africa, about the farm murders happening here and the land grabs. And they went to a local South African, and they asked them, what do you think about this tweet? And the local South African said, a black South African said, Donald Trump can go to hell. We don't want his opinion. We don't care what he thinks about South Africa. And then the headline, and this is the kicker, the headline was South African farmer, because this guy was a farmer, black farmer. Yeah. The headline was South African farmers tell Donald Trump to go to hell. And this was widely reported in the mainstream media. One guy, but they turn it into farmers, plural, to sound like the entire farming community in South Africa is telling Trump to F off. Meanwhile, it's one guy.
That's just amazing to me. I mean, it just shows you in itself, and I'm sure that this happens in every country, and how we ourselves as citizenry or just generalized plebs should take more opportunity to be able to talk to, should we say, I will call you an activist because of your human rights activities that you're doing at the minute. But talk to activists that are actually on the ground. Talk to both sides and find out what the middle ground is between both of them. Because you talk to both sides, you'll find out the truth by merging the two together generally. But if you talk to them, you find out what's actually going on. Like, for instance, most people don't really know what's going on with the Yellow Jackets in France, but yet we're reporting on the Black Jackets because they were migrants that were protesting. But yet nothing on the actual Yellow Jackets that have been going on since December of the year just past. That's amazing. But yet nobody's really talking about that aspect. And I'm sure there's other movements going on in Poland, in Netherlands, in Scandinavia, and in all other countries. But yet our media and the European media probably won't tell you what's going on. The only way that we can is by talking to people like Conscious Caracal in their countries to find out what's actually going on. And we have a
exactly. And I think
that,
yeah, you're kind of framing it like this is like, for example, people in England or people in the US can't find these types of sources. I think it's applicable for even your own country. What's happening in the UK, for example, surrounding Brexit. I mean, if I look at the opinions in the mainstream news in South Africa regarding Brexit, they think you guys are a bunch of psychopaths. They think the UK's lost its mind, and they don't understand it. They only eat up your biased news sources in the narrative, and then they regurgitate it here in South Africa. I have not read one balanced article regarding Brexit in South Africa. They are all just talking about the levers like they are these absolute white supremacist, racist Nazis. And it's shocking to me. So I think what you just said there is applicable not only for people from your country looking to countries like South Africa or France, it applies to countries like South Africa, where South Africans like me are looking at your country, and we are being fed disinformation about your country by your own media.
No, I'm completely not with you. That's kind of where I was going with using the European example, but more across that it's a world wide web by the www. We need to actually be more talkative and connected with everybody that's in different countries. Why we have the opportunity before the countries themselves decide to do what China's doing and stopping people from being able to talk to other people in different countries.
No, exactly.
We just have to then rely on our national media rather than actual people that are on the ground.
Yeah, and the South African media and the British media, it seems, are also fraught with propagandists. So even though the press in South Africa is free, it's definitely not free from bias or narrative manipulation. I mean, you can just look at how the press in South Africa treats Donald Trump as well. No. It's just orange man bad 24/7. And I'm not talking about, I don't want articles praising him as God Emperor Trump. I just want balanced articles that are saying, okay, He was rightfully elected as the president of this country. Let's try and understand why. Let's look objectively at what he has done wrong and what he has done right. And let's put that all together into an article rather than writing a complete smear piece and just saying this absolute madman that is just a tyrant destroying the US and is raining terror across the world. I mean, it's ridiculous. I can see it happening with Boris Johnson in the UK as well through the South African media. The South African media is smearing this guy as an absolute just psychopath, as a fascist even. I mean, there was a guy, and this Pierre de Vos, a South African, who actually was one of the, and I'm pretty sure of this fact, but I might be, no, I'm pretty 99% sure. He was one of the academics that worked on the South African Constitution. He shared a tweet. I have to find it because I don't want to misquote it because it's you're going to find it very funny as someone from the UK, where he posted this. Here it is. So it's a quote from the article, but he's sharing it. He's endorsing the view. He's kind of saying that he agrees with the sentiment of this article. So the article has a very, very unflattering image of Boris Johnson. He's pointing and screaming at someone. And then the quote he takes from the article is, if a developing country had just changed its entire government without an election, we'd be calling it a coup. If the coup had been led by a man clearly unfit for office, we'd be calling that country a failed state. This is the type of rhetoric that we're having in South Africa regarding your own politics.
What?
And this is from The Guardian, by the way.
Oh, it would be from the fucking Guardian.
But I mean, a South African, and we've had an hour and a half conversation about all the failings of South Africa. This South African is flirting with the idea of maybe we should call the UK the victim of a coup or a failed state. I'm like, this is a mainstream opinion. I mean, yeah, Boris Johnson isn't a saint. He's not the Margaret Thatcher. But at the same time, the man's not a fascist. The man's not a dictator.
Ooh, you get yourself shot up here in the north.
No, but I mean, it's this type of rhetoric that just makes it so ridiculous. Like, criticize the man on rational grounds rather than just going completely unhinged and likening him to some type of tyrant. I mean, it's not that much to ask. Can we just have a rational, calm-headed conversation about this? Something else I find very funny is the fact that this South African academic that tweeted this doesn't seem to understand how UK politics work in terms of, I think your system is very similar to ours, where you don't elect a leader, you elect a party, and the party chooses the leader, correct?
Yeah, if you're part of the membership, so say, for instance, me being part of the Conservatives, I would have been able to vote for what's going on as part of the membership, but the general populace can't.
Right. And that's the thing about South Africa as well, is that the ANC chooses the president. The electorate just chooses the ANC. We vote for the party, and then the party internally decides who their leader is. So if this South African academic now says when a leader takes power in a country and that leader was not voted for, that's a coup, I mean, you're pretty much saying that South Africa has suffered 2 coups in the last 20 years because 2 of our presidents already have been removed from office because someone else within the party replaced them as the commander-in-chief, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I find it quite commonplace with people that are not on the left, but in our country, what we'd call Corbynites or Corbynistas, depending on the colloquial, where they are basically champagne socialists or socialists in general. They're quite far left. And they would say that somebody like Boris Johnson that was elected by their membership is not qualified or not right to lead the country because he was only elected by the membership. But yet, if they were to say the same, if we were to say the same thing with Jeremy Corbyn, well, I didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn to be leader of the opposition, so why should he be doing this, blah, blah, blah. It then comes a tit for tat, which is a case of all you need to understand is that the party elects the leader, we elect the party, as you quite rightly said. But it's only to form illegitimacy to try and force a general election so that they can gain the power to try and stop the other people from having it. That's all it is.
Well, I have to say, I've had a very fun time chatting to you about South Africa. We've been going for an hour and a half. I still need to make myself some dinner, so I think we can start closing now. But I really thoroughly enjoyed this chat. Thank you very much for having me on. I'll definitely join you again in the future. We just need to find a time slot again. If something big in South Africa happens, I'd be more than happy to come give my thoughts to you on your platform if you want to.
I do have one more question.
Oh, sure.
It's more of a personal thing, as in I would just like to know for myself. But obviously you said that you're working for the group that you're working for, which is a religious group. Now, does that make you yourself religious or just the idea of working?
Yes, I am myself a Christian. I am religious. The group that I'm working with, it doesn't mean that they only serve, for example, Christian communities. It only means our values are based on Christian values. So that forms the idea, helps form the ideological or value foundation of the organization. It's a very, very interesting group or organization actually, where actually I should say the wider movement, the solidarity movement. Where, like I said earlier, you usually associate the unions or the idea of unions with the left wing, but this is the solidarity movement is a religiously based union, workers' union, and AfriForum at the same time as well. Our values align with Christian values. So yes, there's a religious element to it, but it doesn't mean we only serve, for example, Christian communities or only champion Christian causes. We are pretty much committed to just general justice, efficiency, making sure communities work, freedom in terms of the free market, but also cultural freedom, allowing Afrikaners and Boers to have schools where their children are educated in their mother tongue, and the preservation of our culture, basically.
No, I completely understand. The main reason why I asked was because that I know that I do have some actual anti-theists. Now, I'm an atheist, but I'm not an anti-theist. And I just wanted to point out that just because that you have a religious background or ideology or even work for a religious group, that doesn't mean that they're going to destroy the community that's around them, that it can actually be a base for bringing people together rather than pushing people apart.
No, exactly. And that's the thing, is that even though I'm a Christian, I don't have any problem with you being an atheist. I'm pretty much have a behind closed doors policy when it comes to that. Whatever brings you peace of mind, whatever gives you meaning in your life, you can practice that, as long as you don't infringe on my own rights to have a freedom to practice or not to practice, but to believe what I want to believe. I can't practice anything if it breaks the law. But that's the thing, is that AfriForum does not, for example, take that strong a Christian stance that it would start imposing almost in a tyrannical fashion their values on other communities. We respect the other religions in our country. We respect the other cultures also. So from a cultural aspect, we also don't impose our values. We just try to help communities, but we also through our efforts, but we have that foundation, those foundational values that actually are not only exclusive to Christians. A lot of those values also overlap to other cultures, and they also overlap to even a lot of our values are shared by atheists, I assume, as well. A lot of just basic values like freedoms and freedom of speech, the value of respecting other people, the value of tolerance, those types of values. I don't think that's strictly Christian values. I think those values can be agreed upon by people of both different faiths and people without a faith. I think that's pretty basic things.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say that I think that Judaic Christian values were the foundation for most of society. Now, that doesn't mean that they took everything from Christianity. It doesn't mean they took everything from Judaism. But what I mean by the foundation is they took the best from both, or the best from all, and tried to make it work the best that they can. I'm not one of those atheists that's against religion. I'm not one of those atheists that's against the idea of a God, or if you want to practice. I don't really care. You do you, whatever. I have more of a problem with the militancy of any religion, not Pacific religions. And
Yeah.
everybody's an individual and
Yeah,
has.
as I understand it, you pretty much just ask that you be left alone and be able to practice your spirituality. If you have a spiritual side to your life, that you practice it as you want. And if you don't really take that too seriously, you just want to be left alone. You just want to be able to let people mind their own business when it comes to those very personal matters. If I understand correctly.
No, I completely agree with you. I just found it interesting because when you have a preconception of somebody, I wouldn't put you down as necessarily a Christian, but now it kind of makes more sense of how the conversation has shaped and how the morals have come from. Now, just because you're a Christian, that doesn't mean that you're anti-gay. It doesn't mean you're anti-anything. It just means that you have a set belief in a certain God. It doesn't mean that you take all aspects of that religion.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much correct in terms of. I really just have the core values of Christianity shape a lot of my views, but it doesn't. I still am also committed to the value of tolerance and the value of giving people the opportunity to live their lives freely. I am pretty much against any type of enforcement of values on people. For example, as a Christian, I would never support forcing people to adhere to my religion. They should come freely if they want to. It should be their personal choice always. And I would never want my values to interfere with their freedoms in a tyrannical way. That's also one of my core values, is to give people that to tolerate other religions, tolerate other value systems, not wanting to impose my values on the world as if I am God, knowing that this is the way the world is.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people nowadays have forgotten what tolerance means. Tolerance nowadays means almost embracing everything rather than just being tolerant of it, if that makes sense.
No, I completely understand. Tolerance means disliking it, but letting it happen even though you dislike it, where the embracing is you're accepting wholeheartedly. So I do understand your meaning. Though, as you said, we have been going for, well, almost an hour. Well, almost, what is it? Yeah, almost an hour. Well, almost an hour and 15 minutes, 45 minutes. I'll get there. Time's hard. Time's hard. So I suppose the best thing for me to do is I would like to give you a little bit of a platform. I know that I have a smaller platform than yours, but I would like to be able to give you a platform to try and explain, not necessarily explain, but try and say to people what you think is best, in your opinion, for South Africa moving forward. I know that you said about the organization that you work through, but is there a way, in your opinion, that politics itself might be able to help people? Or is it only the way, not only, wrong word, or do you only prescribe that it would be taking back control that way? I use that as just a term.
For me, it's about, and it touches back on something we talked about earlier, where I think the future of South Africa is where citizens take their futures into their own hands and their destinies into their own hands, rather than depending on government. So if more organizations follow the model of, for example, AfriForum or Solidarity, and more organizations like it sprout up in South Africa, I would be in full support of it. I want more South Africans of all races and colors and cultures and religions to start organizing their communities on their own and not depending on government to fix their problems. Rolling up their sleeves and saying, okay, enough of this. Politicians have created this mess. We're going to get ourselves out of it. That's where I think the future of South Africa lies. And I'm seeing a lot of positive developments in that regard. So I'm not a nihilist or feeling nihilistically pessimistic about South Africa's future. I think there's a future for the people that are tough enough to stay behind and people that are adaptive enough and innovative enough.
I suppose then, I know I said I was wrapping up, but I find it very, very interesting. So I'm sorry if I'm keeping you a little bit, but I would like to just ask this one last question, if I may.
Go for it.
Obviously, I understand what your, should we say, prescription is for South Africa, just as a term to prescribe what we're saying. Would you say that that would work anywhere else, as in what you prescribed, or would you say that that would only work necessarily on the African continent or specifically only in South Africa?
For me, that prescription is my prescription specifically for South Africa. I don't think it's just something you can transplant directly into any other country. When your government becomes as incompetent, as divisive, and as just ineffective as ours, I think you can take elements of it and apply it in your country or other countries as well. But I don't think this strategy is really made for first world countries like America or the UK, where you're not getting constant blackouts or water shortages or sewage running down the streets or just rampant crime and government failure. I don't think that you're at that point where you need these types of actions or strategies that I'm talking about. We're talking about strategies and ideas for countries specifically like South Africa, where the government is actively failing, where the government is not solving problems. Then you have to start doing it yourself. You're forced into that situation rather than almost from a liberty or like a anarchist perspective in the US, where you say, no, down with government. We just want to become separate from government and break it down. In South Africa, you're pretty much, it's not a luxury. You're pretty much forced into that situation of becoming self-sufficient and determining your own destiny and future.
No, that's fair enough. I think that I will end that there. I think that's a good way to end that. Would you like to shill your channel or shill your Twitter or anything else that you have coming up in the future? You're more than welcome.
All I can basically say is there's a link to my channel in the description, Conscious Caracal, and you can find me on Twitter as well under the same name. And if you, I would highly recommend watching the documentary Disrupted Land. You can find that on YouTube. Really highly recommend. I think that'll give you a very valuable perspective on the land debate. And yeah, keep an eye on South Africa. That's the only last thing I would ask to anyone listening. Spare a thought for us on the bottom of the world or on the top, depending on your perspective.
Well, as you heard from Conscious Caracal there, please get in contact with him and ask him about all the questions that you want to. He's going to be more than willing to be able to talk to you about South Africa and what he and his organization are going to be trying to do to make it a better place, how that everything else is going to go on and all that sort of stuff. So please get in contact with him. He's a very good person to talk to. And if you really want to get him talking, start talking about the idea of philosophy. You won't get him to shut up on that.
That pretty much sums it up, man.
But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, however you may identify, I bid you farewell, I bid you adieu, and I'll speak to you all again real soon.